Well, I am so pleased to have with us on the show today Heritage Foundation Research Fellow and Public Finance Economist EJ Antoni. EJ, thanks so much for being with us today.
Virginia, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You recently wrote a really cheery piece for the New Hampshire Journal titled How Coming Recession May Have Already Arrived. So let's talk about some of that news, EJ. Has a recession arrived? Are we or are we not in a recession?
Well, Virginia, if you ask the American people, more than half of them say yes, we are already in a recession because that's essentially how their personal finances are doing right now. First off, I mean, what is a recession? It just is when the economy shrinks. So it's when the total amount of income we're earning or the total amount of things we're producing, however you want to measure the economy, that total is going down instead of up. So not a good sign. And for a lot of American households today, again, a majority of them, the case is that their incomes may be up, but they can buy less with those incomes. Their standard of living is declining as the cost of living explodes. And essentially, what we are seeing on a macro level, in other words, if we look at the economy as a whole, we take a wide angle lens here, we are seeing the economy grow, but only because we have essentially a debt bomb going on where the federal government and American households are just taking on more and more debt in order to fuel today's consumption. And the problem is you can't have that go on forever. Eventually, the music stops.
We have a very high national debt, and you recently wrote on X that the prediction is before the end of the year, we're going to hit $36 trillion in national debt. It's really hard, EJ, to wrap your mind around a number that big. Or do we have any other countries on the planet who have a national debt close to that large?
Not really, Virginia, but part of that has to do with the size of our economy. It's the fact that the United States is such a big economy, so we can sustain a much higher debt load. It's like the difference between a family making $50,000 versus $500,000, and each of them having $10,000 worth of credit card debt. In the one case, it could be crippling. In the other case, it's basically a rounding error. So for the United States, so if you want to consider how big our debt is to our economy, it's now bigger. In other words, we owe more than we produce in an entire year. We haven't seen levels like this since World War II. Are there some countries around the world who are in worse shape by that metric? Yes, Japan is a very good example of that. But what has been the result in Japan? It has been completely anemic economic growth. They are having all kinds of problems with their currency, including some very fast inflation. So it's not as if, again, this is in any way sustainable. It's not.
Inflation, that sounds very familiar. Can we draw a direct line between the national debt and inflation and what we're seeing in the economy? Because I do have a bit of a theory, EJ, that it can be difficult because the number is so big and because, quite frankly, both Republicans and Democrats have added to the national debt. It's not a super popular issue when it actually comes to like cutting those costs and getting the national debt down. And because I think the American people don't always connect rising inflation with national debt, I don't think there's that same pressure on politicians to actually tackle the national debt if there was that direct link being made. So if you would paint a little bit of the picture of how does that soon-to-be $36 trillion national debt, how does that affect you, me, a family of four in Ohio when they're going to a grocery store to buy groceries?
It's a great question, Virginia. And so many people, unfortunately, don't understand this. Essentially, the Federal Reserve finances a lot of these government deficits. And unlike the Treasury, which has to finance everything either through taxes or borrowing money, the Federal Reserve actually can just create money. And when it does that, it's like you're pouring water into wine and you're literally watering it down. So yes, you now have more wine per se, but you don't have the same concentration of alcohol. So if you were to, as a bartender, pour this out to a bunch of glasses, let's say, you are now cheating each of your customers on exactly the amount of water you have put into all of their glasses. That's essentially what the Federal Reserve has done by creating literally trillions of dollars in just a few years in order to finance the runaway deficit spending we've seen here in Washington. Now, absent all of that runaway profligate spending, the Federal Reserve really doesn't have any incentive to engage in that kind of behavior, to print all this money and to cause inflation. And so once you realize what the political environment is in which the Fed operates, it's very easy to see that these massive government deficits are really what's at the heart of inflation. Even if they don't cause it in a strictly academic sense, it is still what's going on. In some ways, you could say the Fed is the getaway driver for the government who's actually robbing the bank. So, looking forward, unfortunately, this Fed does not seem to have the discipline in order to really kill inflation, in order to drive a stake through the heart of that beast. They're already getting ready to cut interest rates. And at the end of the day, it is going to basically put us right back onto the roller coaster. It's shockingly similar, Virginia, to what we did in the 1970s, where when the Fed was on the brink of success of getting rid of inflation, they went right back to cutting rates and right back to financing the runaway spending out of Washington. And the result was not only a massive spike in inflation, bigger than the previous one, but back-to-back recessions, the worst since the Great Depression.
So if you were at the Fed and you were having the opportunity to pull those levers on interest rates and say, hey, these are the next steps we need to take, what would your recommendations be?
I wouldn't even try to set interest rates, Virginia. The Fed should be following markets, not trying to lead them. This is central planning at its heart. I mean, it is literally a central bank. And we need to get away from that mindset. We need to get away from that kind of not just thinking, but that kind of implementing policy. We should not have any kind of government or even quasi-government entity trying to set interest rates throughout the economy. Supply and demand will set interest rates on its own. But the problem here is that supply and demand are so incredibly out of balance. And that's because of the Treasury. We forget that the interest rate is just a price. It's the price for borrowing money. And that price is essentially determined by the supply of money available to be borrowed and the demand for money to be borrowed. Who is the biggest borrower in the entire economy? The federal government, who's trying to borrow literally over $2 trillion every year. And as a result of that, it has created a massive increase in the demand for borrowed money, which increase in demand puts upward pressure on price. So that increases the price of borrowed money. That's the interest rate. And the reason the Fed is working so hard to manipulate interest rates is to try to prevent them from rising as a consequence of what the Treasury is doing. Again, borrowing trillions of dollars a year. So the solution is not to have some kind of bureaucratic, autocratic institution manipulate prices within the economy. The solution is to have the Treasury not borrow so much and not inflict so much pain, frankly, on the loanable funds market.
Let's say we hit that point where everyone was in agreement, hey, we got to kind of be a little more hands off, and that natural ebb and flow within that, would we see maybe more of a natural rising and falling where it wouldn't be as stable? Because as speaking as a non-economist, my understanding for so much of the reason of the manipulation is trying to keep America away from recessions, away from depressions, and trying to manipulate things in order to create stability. But EJ, is that just simply not possible within an economy? You kind of have to allow for natural troughs and valleys and mountain peaks. Or can you be a little more hands-off and still see stability? Is that possible?
Virginia, it's a great question. And it's not really so much that the Federal Reserve prevents recessions and prevents inflations, although that is how it's sold to the American people. That's also how it was sold in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created. And yet what happened after the Fed? We've had our worst inflation as a republic, and we have also had our worst recessions and depressions. Let's not forget, we didn't have a Great Depression until after the Federal Reserve was created. We didn't have the inflation of the 1970s, for example, until after the Fed was created. And so all of the things that this institution was allegedly supposed to prevent, it turned around and caused. On top of that, the booms and the busts, which again was supposed to alleviate, it has only made them worse. We never had the kind of stock market explosions like we saw in the late 1920s, like we saw in the late 1990s with the dot-com bubble, like we're seeing right now. Frankly, we never had those kind of equity bubbles until after the Federal Reserve came into place, and we also never saw the kind of implosions like we saw with the housing market in 2006, 7, 8, 9. Those kinds of things never happened before a central bank because you didn't have a single entity coordinating a massive rise and a massive fall in prices throughout the whole economy.
So would you advocate for just getting rid of that central bank?
Oh, I certainly would. And a lot of people ask, well, what would you replace the Fed with? Why do you need to replace it with anything? When you remove a tumor from a patient, with what do you replace it? Nothing. You've restored them to health. I mean, there's no reason why we can't go back to a commodity-backed currency like we had, before the Federal Reserve. In fact, even when the Federal Reserve was first instituted, or was first created rather, you still had a currency that was backed by gold, and that really doesn't end. It begins to end, I should say, with FDR, and then finally Nixon kills it entirely. Although interestingly, what Nixon does, he does with an executive order. So presumably the next president with an executive order could also undo it. In other words, return the dollar to gold redemption status. So it's not as if all hope is lost. It's not as if we can't fix the problem. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be painful. There's going to be an adjustment period. But you certainly could get rid of the central bank. It is, after all, our fourth one.
Wow. Okay. EJ, I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about jobs numbers and what we just saw. We had you on the Daily Signal Top News podcast earlier this week just to give a really brief rundown on what we saw this week and the fact that jobs numbers were anticipated and reported to be way higher initially. And now we've learned, oops, that number was about 800,000 off. How did this happen and what does it mean for the U.S. economy?
Well, essentially, the Labor Department has some serious problems with their models and methodologies in terms of trying to come up with these different statistics. And so there are plenty of people out there who are saying, "Oh, they're cooking the books, and there's something illegal going on." To be perfectly clear, I have zero evidence of that whatsoever. I actually know some people over at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I have no reason to believe that any of them are doing anything underhanded. But where I think the real scandal is, Virginia, is the fact that the problems in these statistics have been evident since the spring of 2022. In other words, for 2 years now, it has been clear there was a problem. The Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Labor Department as a whole has done nothing to solve the problem. And at this point, I think there should be some kind of investigation because they owe Congress and, frankly, the American people an explanation as to, number one, what is wrong, and number two, why they have done nothing to fix it. It really appears that one of the big things going on right now is something called the birth-death model, which has to do with the birth and death of businesses. So when a firm is created or when a firm goes out of business, that is typically going to change the total number of people employed because new businesses tend to employ people. And when that firm goes out of business, all those jobs are lost. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics is constantly trying to account for things like that it can't constantly observe, but are happening in the economy and will affect the number of jobs. The problem is that what we are seeing today in terms of these businesses is not the case of what we saw in 2019 or even in 2020. What I mean by that is you are seeing a lot of businesses get started today that fail. And then you're seeing even among the ones that succeed, they're not actually employing people. It's basically just a sole proprietorship. And so if you are still assuming that these businesses, number one, are being much more successful than they actually are, and then number two, are hiring many more people than they actually are, your estimate for job growth is going to be way off. That's exactly what we've seen for well over a year now. And as a consequence of that, when we finally get better data, we need to massively revise the previous numbers down. So not only did we see a loss of 800,000 jobs added over the course of 12 months, but if you go back and you look at each of those 12 months on a monthly basis, you find that the difference from the original estimate to the revised estimate, you add all that up, that's over 300,000 off, again, downward direction. So you have over 300,000 there, plus another 800,000. You combine it, it's almost 1.2 million jobs. So that essentially means that a third of all the jobs we thought we had added over a 12-month period never even existed.
So, EJ, then how would you label the state of the economy right now? What grade would you give it, and where are we headed?
Well, I would say anemic is probably the best way to put it, Virginia. Unfortunately, what we're seeing right now, if we look just at businesses for a moment, we are seeing new orders just completely collapse. I mean, it's astonishing. There's just not enough new business coming in, and the problem there is to sustain current output levels, you need a commensurate amount of new orders. Well, if your new orders are dropping, you're going to have to decrease production. That means you're going to buy less supplies. You're not going to employ as many people. You're not going to be using as many resources, whether it's utilities, whatever the case may be. So all of that spending is going down. That production is going down. On the consumer side, households, Virginia, are just completely tapped out today. There's no other way to put it. We have over $1.1 trillion in credit card debt, and the interest rate on those credit cards is near a record high. So those two things combine to create a situation where, for the first time ever, families are paying over $300 billion a year just in interest on those credit cards. So we're not talking about paying down the principal. This is just the financing charges. So that will go on forever because you're not actually reducing your principal. But if you also look at the number of households that have negative cash flow, in other words, they're having to spend more on necessities than they're earning in income, that means they're adding to those credit card balances. So that situation is likely to get worse. Really, it's only about the top 10% of households that have any savings left. Most Americans have gone deeply into debt. These high interest rates, again, are now keeping them there because of the punishingly high financing costs that they're facing on their debt loads. This is true for mortgages, auto loans, student loans, credit cards, you name it. People aren't able to pay these debts. That's why you're seeing the delinquency rates on auto loans just skyrocket right now at the fastest pace since the Great Recession. So this all points to a consumer that really can't afford to spend anymore. And when you consider that consumer spending is somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the economy, that does not bode well. And this kind of brings us back to the first thing we were talking about, which is a recession already here? I think it's likely it is. And we never quite know exactly when we're in it, when that recession begins. Likewise, when the economy returns to growth, you never quite know when that is. And so you have to look back with months worth of hindsight to see, was this a speed bump, a blip on the radar, or was this really the cusp? Was this really the turning point? And I would not be surprised if we ultimately look back and we see August as the month that we did slip back from expansion into contraction.
Wow. EJ, Congress is currently out of session, but budgets and finances are a big responsibility that falls on Congress, and they're going to be back in September. What can we expect as Congress moves into what is supposed to be kind of their budget season as they prepare for the new fiscal year, the end of one fiscal year, the beginning of a new one? Any predictions on what we're going to see?
Oh, goodness, Virginia, I hate to give in to despair, but my prediction is disappointment and lots of it. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of people in Congress who are willing, frankly, to put the country before themselves. And maybe that's not even necessarily a knock on those in Congress. Maybe that's just points to the human condition, I suppose. It seems that no matter who you elect to Congress, no matter how good, quote unquote, they are, they end up doing the wrong thing eventually. So unfortunately, again, we don't have a lot of fiscal hawks, and we have a lot of people who seem intent on kicking the can down the road. Not to mention the fact that you also have one of the chambers of Congress, the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats at this point. And not that it's strictly a Republican-Democrat issue, because it's not. You said that earlier yourself, and it's true. But the problem is that you can pretty much always count on the Democrats to vote together as a bloc for more spending, more taxes, more regulation. And the Republicans don't seem to have that same kind of cohesiveness. So I would not be surprised if you do get a few of those rhinos, a few of the non-conservatives, to go along with their more liberal members and unfortunately spend more. The other big problem is that what we had with the last debt ceiling deal, which was a total disaster, is they literally suspended the debt ceiling. We technically have one, but it's not even enforceable right now. So nothing happens after you blow past it. However, come January, we're going to hit that. And it's going to be up to a lame duck Congress who will have zero accountability to their elected, to their constituents. They will have zero accountability to actually do the right thing, which would be to cut spending.
Well, EJ, I can't accuse you of being too cheery, but I do appreciate the knowledge that you bring on this topic and your in-depth analysis. Thank you for always shooting straight. We appreciate it. Appreciate the work you do at the Heritage Foundation, and appreciate you spouting off on X with great charts and data. Tell our listeners, how can they follow your work?
X is going to be the best place to find me. The handle there is @real EJ Antoni.
Great. EJ, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.